Today we're going to talk about friction. Friction is something you learn about probably for the first time in elementary school. So when I say what is friction, what do you think of? What examples come to mind? Is it this? This is a good example of friction. Rubbing your hands together is friction. But today we're going to talk about the different types of friction and how we can increase and decrease friction. So friction's definition is actually when two surfaces exert a force on each other, like your hands, two surfaces rubbing together. But it can be all sorts of things. One type of friction is sliding friction, and that's when you have two surfaces that are solid surfaces exerting forces on each other. So if you are walking, or if you are rubbing your hands together, or if you're scooting your feet across the carpet because you want to shock your little brother or little sister with static electricity, those are good examples of solid surfaces exerting a force on each other, and therefore they're good examples of sliding friction. Rolling friction is a little bit different. Rolling friction is when one surface rolls over another surface, and sometimes that means that one of the surfaces might be a wheel or a tire, but it can also be other things. So if you think about a car moving down the road, that's rolling friction, or a bicycle or a skateboard. But if you think back to some of the silly cartoons that you've seen where one character throws out a bunch of marbles or gumballs and another character can't keep their traction because they're stepping on those things that are rolling, that's an example of rolling friction as well. And then we have fluid friction. And it's important to know that fluids can be either a liquid or a gas. A fluid is anything that flows easily from one place to another. So an example of fluid friction would be swimming, the water and your skin being the two surfaces, or falling through the air because you decided to go skydiving. That's air and your skin, and that's also fluid friction. You might have even at some point experienced windburn on your face out on a boat or on a windy day if you went skiing or something like that. That's because of the friction between the air and the skin on your face. Those are the two surfaces. Now, we can change the amount of friction by changing two different factors. One of them is the amount of force, and the other is the type of surface. So if you take your hands and you barely touch them together and rub them back and forth, that's not a lot of force. That's very little friction. But if you press them together with all your strength and you move them back and forth, then you've increased the amount of force, and therefore you've also increased the amount of friction. If you're sanding a piece of furniture, you can't just lightly sand it with the sandpaper. You really have to apply some force because you need to increase the friction to remove the surface that you're trying to remove. The other thing is, of course, the type of surface. And with furniture, for instance, when you have sandpaper, not all sandpaper is the same. Some sandpaper has big chunks of sand and it's much rougher. And when you use that on a piece of furniture, it digs in a little bit more than when it's a smoother piece of sandpaper. Maybe an easier example to understand is if you have your hand and a piece of sandpaper instead and you rub them back and forth, you're going to get more friction than if it's your two hands rubbing together only. So I'm going to give you some examples of how changing the surface actually changes the friction. So we have pie pans here, and this is a pie pan, this is a pie pan, two solid surfaces. When I try to move them, there's friction, and it's sliding friction, and it requires that I actually continue to turn the pan. But if I wanted to change the surface, I could potentially add some marbles in my pie pan. That makes this now rolling friction. And when I try to spin the pan, it spins a little more easily because we've reduced the amount of friction that's actually happening here. And we can also use fluid friction. Fluid friction happens when you have a gas or a liquid, remember. So in this case, we're going to use water. I have one pan full of water, and I know that there is someone out there named Ethan that is just cheering for me to spill this, but I'm not going to. So when we have water in the pan, place our other pan on top. Now we're gonna see what fluid friction looks like. And if I spin it, it spins pretty easily and it continues to spin because there's less friction now that I've added a fluid or water. Another example of fluid friction is when you play air hockey. When the table turns off and there's no more air, the friction then becomes sliding friction and it increases. So to recap, we have sliding friction, two solid surfaces, rolling friction when one surface rolls over another, fluid friction where there's a liquid or a gas, and then we can change the friction by changing the amount of force between the two surfaces or changing the type of surface. You should be able now to identify different types of friction.